Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being with us. So last week I started off with this idea. Goldilocks was right. Goldilocks was right. And the way that we got to that is, of course, in the story, Goldilocks was found herself lost in the woods in the Three Bears house, and she was trying different things. She was trying the rocking chair, she was trying the porridge, and she was trying the beds. And one was to this, the other was to that, but then there was one that was just right. She tried the beds, and one was too hard, and one was too soft, and one was just right. And there she fell asleep and took her nap. And what that reminded me of is it reminded me of the middle way in Buddhism. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the extremes. The extremes in, I will call it worldview or philosophy, or the way that people look at things. I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that the physical phenomena around us, the things that we see, that we hear, that we touch, those sorts of things, they get processed through something we call consciousness, something that we don't understand, something that scientists still struggle with, like what is it and why is it? What is the reason for consciousness? But my point is, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. We limit what comes into our field of awareness based on what we expect to come into our field of awareness. So we are constantly experiencing a world that is largely of our own perception, our own creation. Two people in the same place at the same time, witnessing the same thing, see and report two entirely different things. Right? This is why eyewitness reports are now no longer accepted as verbatim truth. And when we were kids growing up, we watched Perry Mason. Why, if there was an eyewitness who saw something, that was just about it. But now we're finding out that what people see and what really happened might be two different things. So one worldview looks at the world through what we would call a materialistic lens, matter. And by and large, if you look at Western science, starting from like the 1600s, so very interesting, we have to remember what the Dark Ages were, right? There was a time in Europe where any foray into sciences and arts and those sorts of things, they were frowned upon, because the church told people, you don't need that to get to heaven. You just need to do what the church tells you to do to get to heaven, and that's all that really matters, right? So don't spend any time with these other things. But then there was the Renaissance came along. People pushed back against that and said, well, we need to explore this world in which we live. We need to understand the things that are around us, this magnificent universe in which we live. And there was sort of this resurgence. Now, that period of progression that stopped in Europe, it was going on in other parts of the world. In fact, much of what we gathered, or we the Europeans gathered, we got from the Arab countries. Medicine and science, it was progressing along. And if you ever want to go far afield and just explore something that we take for granted but is extremely interesting, is look up the origin of the number 0 and the importance that the number 0 had in advancing the human intellect. But when our science came about, when we started to get back into it, because most of our culture here is influenced by European culture, our science is very concerned about what can be weighed and what can be measured, what can be touched, what can be felt, all those sorts of things. And it's very, very focused on matter and the material things. And it even has come to a point where in some discussions in scientific circles, the question has been posed as to whether or not a thought experiment could be a real experiment because thoughts can't be weighed and measured and touched and those sorts of things. So you can see how this worldview, this orientation that which is matter is real, which is not matter, doesn't exist or may not exist, or we can't ever understand it. Sort of an agnostic view. We can't understand it, so we're not going to waste time looking into it. So that's what we were talking about last week. We were starting to talk about the worldview that says that life is matter, and somehow the chemicals of the earth, somehow the dust of the earth, it formed itself into life. Chemicals created life. Electricity, some theories are, well, a lightning bolt flashing down into some type of primordial soup was just the right catalyst to cause life to be formed. And then life evolved. You see, life evolved. We had single-celled animals, and then we had multi-celled animals, and then the cells started to get together and specialize, into organs that pump blood and organs that digest food and all those things. But the point of view, the world point of view, is that all of these things that we're talking about is all based in matter. Matter is real, and that which is not matter, spirit, for example, soul, God, those sorts of things, well, that's not real. It's not real. It can't be weighed, can't be measured, can't be touched. So it's not real. Or it can't be known. It can't be known because we can't know it within our guidelines of how we know things. That's kind of what we were talking about last week. If you weren't here last week, the talk is up on YouTube. Please go back and listen to it, because there is a lot more to that. And where I was going with that is, but if we look at this thing called evolution, if we look at the progression of life from the tiniest celled animal, so we might want to think of something that Troard gives us in the Fifth Kingdom, and also in mystical Judaism, in the Kabbalah, we get kind of this idea. So we start with the minerals, we start with rocks, and what is the primary property of matter? But it's inertia. It just sits there. It just sits there, right? And somehow the minerals kind of evolved. Somehow the minerals kind of got together and caused life, if you want to put it that way, created life, if you want to think about it that way. But then we went through kind of the plants, maybe slime and algae and all those kind of things. But the plants started to come out of that. And then we started to get into the animals, into the animal kingdom, the creatures of the forest, the creatures of the sea, the fishes, the birds, all those kind of things. And then eventually we got to a human being. And if we look at evolution, if we look at the progress of evolution, if we look at the characteristics of it, with every iteration, with every step forward, there was a step forward into a greater degree of mobility and a greater degree of intelligence. So if you wanted to look and say, well, what is the purpose of evolution? We might say, well, it seems to be pointing in this direction of greater freedom of movement, greater degree of awareness, greater degree of intelligence. So, there's simple awareness, right? There's just simple awareness, aware of the surroundings, and we can imagine the animals in the forest. Lori and I were up in the mountains a couple of weeks ago, and when I went out to pack the car, there were three deer standing at the edge of the parking lot, and they were just munching on the trees and the shrubs and things that were growing along the edge of the parking lot. They were aware of their surroundings. Clearly, they were aware that I was there. They stopped and looked at me. They were aware of what they were doing and what they were eating. There was clearly an awareness there. When we were looking into into our Wednesday night group, we were looking into a book called The Physics of God, and I love to go off and kind of look to the side and explore other things. This question keeps coming up: does brain cause consciousness, or did consciousness cause the brain? And I discovered there's a jellyfish that has hundreds of eyes. So it's aware of its environment, it's aware of its surrounding, but it has no brain. It has no brain. So if it doesn't have a brain that we think of in order to process this information, there's something else going on there. It's aware of its environment. It has eyes, it can see more than we can see. But yet it doesn't have the organ that materialistic science would tell us, well, that's consciousness comes from the brain. See? So we have the simple awareness. We have the creatures in the forest. We have the creatures in the sea. They are aware, no doubt about it. And then as we come to human beings, we kind of come to, as far as we know, we kind of come to a different level of consciousness that only exists in human beings. I wouldn't be surprised if it existed in other creatures as well, but we claim this to be our unique niche in life, and that is a self-awareness. We are not only aware of our surroundings, but we are aware of thought. We are aware of thinking. We can choose our thoughts. So we have this very unique perspective when we come into the human realm of not just being aware of an environment, not just reacting to our environment, but we can be aware of our reactions to the environment. We can be aware of our thoughts of the environment. So from a materialistic point of view, from just simply looking at evolution as chemicals and electricity and those sorts of things, but it seems to be moving along this line of greater freedom of movement, of greater intellectual ability to produce what we have in human beings. But nevertheless, when we get into the material view, we can say, well, that happened. It just happened, and we live in an environment, a universe where there's all kinds of possibilities, and it's kind of what we used to talk about in high school. If you had enough monkeys and you trained them to how to use a typewriter, and you just let them peck away at the typewriters forever, it would be possible, or theoretically possible, that everything that could ever be written they would produce. All of the works of Shakespeare, the Bible in its entirety, all of these kind of things. So it's kind of like, if enough stuff is happening, then this is possible. It's possible that life just happened, life just evolved. And when we look at that materialistic view, what happens is in science, sometimes I think things get misunderstood. There's one thing to say, well, if it can't be measured and weighed and touched physically or with the instruments that we have, then we can't know it because we don't have a way of knowing it. Right? So that's obvious. So if I close my eyes and there's a light in the room, I don't know it. I don't have a way of knowing that the light is there. We know that there are sounds, for example, that animals hear that we don't hear. The silent dog whistles. We understand that some insects can see parts of light, which is part of the radio frequency spectrum, that we don't see. So even though we can't quite perceive it, even though we can't quite see it, there may still be other things there. But when you're coming from the materialistic point of view, you have to say, if there is something that is beyond all of our physical abilities to measure, then the best that we can say is we can't measure it. We can't, because we don't have a way of doing that. And I think what has happened is, in some schools of thought, that has become distorted, at least in my point of view, distorted to say, if we can't weigh it, if we can't measure it, if we can't touch it, it doesn't exist. It's not real. Whereas I think a more appropriate answer would be it may or it may not be real. But we don't know because we can't measure it with the tools that we have. So this is where we have kind of evolved into, if you look at spirituality from the purely materialistic point of view, you might say you would adopt an atheistic point of view. There is no such thing as God. We can't weigh it, we can't measure it, we can't touch it, therefore it does not exist. Or an agnostic point of view, which says, well, it may be there, but we don't know. And we don't have a way of knowing, and there's no sense wasting time trying to figure out things that we have no way of knowing. So that kind of finishes or brings to a conclusion what I wanted to say about the first orientation of the world. And remember, we get to experience the world based on what we expect. So if we have that viewpoint and we expect that to be so, then everything that we look at starts to look like that. Everything we look at supports our pre-existing belief. Excuse me while I get a drink. So the flip side of the argument, the other side, so that so that might be like the bed is too soft or the bed is too hard. But if you look at the other side of the argument kind of came in from the ascetics in ancient India, and even to some extent into some of the more modern religions. And that is that the flesh is the illusion. See? So the materialists might say, well, spirit is the illusion, soul is the illusion, God is an illusion. It's just, it doesn't exist. We have no proof of it, therefore it doesn't exist. If we take the ascetic point of view, they said, no, see, spirit is all that there is. Spirit is the only thing that there is. Soul is the only thing that there is. God is the only thing that there is. Brahman is the only thing that there is. And the flesh is the illusion. The matter is the illusion. And because we believe so strongly in the illusion of the matter, we are kind of stuck with it. We are kind of bound by it. So remember in Plato's Republic, he gave the allegory of the people in the cave. The people, they are in a cave and they have been there their whole lives and they're trapped in such a way that they can't see the door of the cave, but they can only see the shadows that project on the wall. And to them, that's reality. What they see as a shadow on the wall, that's what they believe to be real. And one day, one of the occupants of the cave manages to escape his chains, and he goes out the door. And the first thing that happens is he's blinded by the light. His eyes can't handle the light. He's blinded by the light. And of course, Plato's talking about the mystical experience. He's blinded by the light. Think of Paul getting knocked off the horse on the way to Damascus. He's blinded by the light, but after his eyes adjust, then he can see that there's a whole other world out there. There's a whole other world. There are people walking down the road. The sun is behind them, and they are casting a shadow on the wall. There are horses pulling carts, and et cetera, et cetera. So he suddenly realizes that everything that he believed that was real was only a shadow, only a figment of the imagination, that there is a different reality that is projecting that. There's a different force, if you want to call it a force. There's a different force that is causing the shadow on the wall. But as long as he was in the cave, he believed the shadow was real. So he goes back into the cave and he tries to tell the people, listen, there's a whole other world outside there. What you're seeing as the shadow, that is the illusion. That is the illusion. And of course the people think he's crazy, that they won't listen to him. So this is kind of where we come into the world that denies materialism. So you might say that materialism, as I described it, denies spirituality. And then you have spirituality that denies matter. It denies matter as being real. Spirit is the only thing that's real. Soul is the only thing that's real. God is the only thing that's real. And the way to spiritual growth is to defeat the matter, to subdue it, to go struggle with it. See, this is the view of life is a struggle. You got to get in there and you have to beat it down. You have to You have to make it do your bidding. So these were the forest dwellers of the ancient times. These were the people who lived in the forest, who didn't wear clothes, who didn't seek shelter, who lived in the elements, who lived in the rain, and who even rejected food. Because spirit is all there is. Spirit is energy. What we really need is energy. We don't need food. And they were set out to prove that. So that was the example we got to with the Buddha, who was sitting under the tree, and he was practicing this extreme life of austerity. And he was down to 1 grain of rice a day. In this story, he's near death. He's near death. He's just about starved himself to death in order to prove the supremacy of consciousness, of spirit, over matter. And at that point, he's by a river, and there's a raft floating down a river, and on the raft is a music teacher instructing a student on a stringed instrument, and the teacher says, now, if you tune the string too tight, it will break. If you tune a string too loose, it won't play. But if you tune it in the middle, then you can make music. And this is when Buddha developed his concept of the middle way. Okay? So we can't progress spiritually if we believe that matter is all that there is and spirit doesn't exist. And on the other hand, if we are living in a world excuse me, that is made up of matter, and we want to struggle against it, right? We're tuning it too tight, we're struggling against it. I mean, if you read any of the stories of some of the Christians in I guess kind of medieval times, who pretty much abused the body in order to prove that they were going to dominate it. They wore clothes that had nails stuck through them so that their skin would be irritated. They ate very little. They wore horsehair coats. They flogged themselves with whips. They did all of these kind of things because they were fighting against the flesh. And of course, that which you are fighting against, you are stuck to. That which you are fighting against, you are stuck to. We have to remember that. So if matter really is an illusion, because it is the shadow that we're looking at that is being caused by something else, then the more we struggle with it, the more we are stuck to it. We can't get away from it. So one could argue and say, well, the reality that it has is the reality that we give to it, because if we didn't believe it was real, we wouldn't have to struggle with it. It's kind of like whistling past the graveyard, I'm not afraid of ghosts, but I'm just going to whistle past as I walk past the graveyard because it scares them away. So we have these two opposing views. One is based on matter, that spirit is the illusion, and then the other is that spirit is the only reality and matter is the illusion. And this seems to be the struggle. This seems to be the struggle that we run into in the world. And as I said last week, then what happens is when we have a seeming pair of opposites, two contradictory things, then perhaps there is another truth, a higher truth. There is a place where these two things come together, and we can see them each as part of this. And that's where we want to go with the middle way. So, for example, when we were reading the book on physics, a lot about particles and how particles are created in the colliders. And when particles come into existence, they come from energy into existence, into existence as matter. They come in pairs. They come in pairs. And each member of the pair has characteristics that are completely opposite of the other. And these characteristics are defined by physicists. And the interesting thing is that if you can alter the characteristics of one, the characteristics of the other immediately adjust to remain in complete opposition. And this takes place without regard to distance, without regard to how far apart these particles are. Even if they were light years apart, the change in one instantaneously produce a change in the other. So obviously the two are connected somehow. We don't know how, but the two are connected somehow, and they are connected perhaps at a different level, at a higher level, from whence they came, let's put it that way. So these things kind of came into material existence from somewhere, but they're still connected in that somewhere is the best way that I can understand it and the best way that I can explain it. So here we have these two opposing worldviews. We have the one view that says matter is the only reality, and we have the other view that says spirit is the only reality. And now we're looking for a middle way. One is too hard, one is too soft. Now we're looking for a middle way that says, well, maybe matter and spirit are just two parts of the same whole. Maybe they're just two parts of the same thing. Maybe they're like the two particles that have come into existence and they appear to be opposite. But they can't be, because they need to be part of something else that connects them. So one thing that helps me when I kind of go through this, because it's very deep, right? Very, very complex when we go through this, what do we mean by real? What is it that is real? What do we mean by reality? And the definition that really helps me when it comes to spiritual books and spiritual talks and those sorts of things is that which has the ability to sustain itself. That which has the ability to sustain itself. That which is a cause, but is not the effect. That which is the cause, but is not the effect. So now, if we start to look at these two worldviews of that which is matter and that which is spirit, and is there a third way, a middle way, a higher way that combines them? See, then we can start to understand what the mystics are. Is it that has itself? What is it that is cause rather than effect? What is it that is cause rather than effect? If you stop and take the example of water, we recognize the liquid water covers most of the face of the earth, but we realize that that is only one state that water can have, that H2O can have. It can exist as a very, very formless state that we call vapor or steam, or it can exist as a very, very solid thing that we call ice. And yet they are all chemically exactly the same. Water, liquid, steam, vapor, ice, solid. And what we want to come to when we're looking for a middle way, if we're looking for a higher way, we might say then that matter is the equivalent of ice. It's solid, it is tangible, but it's nothing more than energy. It is nothing more than energy. Right? Einstein told us that with his famous E equals mc squared. Somehow the invisible energy takes this form, which is matter. So matter is a state of energy expressing itself. And what is this thing that we call spirit or consciousness? Is it not also a state of energy expressing itself, the energy of God, the energy of life. So if we start to perceive then, if we start to raise our worldview that says it's not one or the other, but it's both, because both are part of something greater than itself, great, something that is greater than either one of them, then we can start to see that there's no need for a struggle, that there is no need to subdue. Because if matter is simply energy taking the form of matter, what is there to struggle against? Probably the best example that I have come across is the idea of a shadow. If you and I look in a room and there's a light shining and we kind of put our hand out, we used to make shadow puppets for the kids, make the rabbits on the wall or the birds or those kind of things. You can make the shadow, and the shadow appears to be real, and it's a rabbit or it is a bird, right? But it has no ability to sustain itself. It is only in existence for as long as the conditions that created it exist. There's a source of light, and then there's something obstructing that light. If you turn out the light, the shadow's gone. If you pull your hand out from in front of the light, the shadow is gone. Now you've all seen the videos on TV, funniest videos of little kids who are frightened by their own shadow. They don't know what to make of it. This thing is following them around, and they can't make it go away. They become frightened by it, and yet it's not real. It's not. It cannot threaten them. It cannot harm them in any way. What is going on is the fear is in their mind. And one of the most interesting things that I saw about helping children overcome that fear was a man from India, and the child was frightened, and he said, "Oh no!" He says, "Watch." He says, "I'll take care of that for you." And he put his hand in the light, and he brought his hand down over the child's head. So his hand came down and grabbed the shadow. He says, "Now don't worry about it. I've got this shadow under control for you." And he said to the child, he says, "I can show you how to do it yourself." And he had the child lift its hand up and see the shadow of their own hand, and then brought their hand down until they captured the shadow. Once that child realized that they could control the shadow, they were no longer afraid of it. So what we come to then is there's no need to argue. There's no need to struggle against matter, and there's no need for matter to struggle against spirit, because they are two parts of the same whole. They are energy. And what is consciousness? What is thought? It is a movement within energy. Thought is a movement within consciousness. And what is this thing that we call consciousness? The best we can say is it must be energy. We don't know. We don't know what it is. So when you hear a spiritual teacher say there's no such thing as sin, sickness, or disease, they're not saying that the experience of these things, that we don't have the experience of these things. What they're saying is they're not necessary because they are all conditions. Matter does not have the ability to make itself sick. It does not. Something else is going on there. There's something else involved in the appearance of the disease. So just like the shadow that appears to be real, we have experiences in our lives that appear to be very real. But they don't have the ability to sustain themselves. They are caused. They are effects. They're caused by something else. And now what we want to do is come back to and say, well, what is that something else? Is that where we should be focusing our attention? Excuse me. What is this something else that is beyond? Excuse me. I'm going to take another drink of water here. So this is where we start to get into, as Dr. Holmes would tell us, let's work in first cause. Let's work in first cause. Let's try not to work into secondary causation. Now, medicine works in secondary causation, and that's fine. And what religious science would tell us is, if that's where we are, and seeking medical help is appropriate for our healing, and let's just recognize that every hand that touches us is the loving hand of God. The brain that works through the doctors and the people in the hospital is the loving hand of God, the loving thought of God. So we don't reject that. We don't we don't say, oh no, we're not going to do that because it's working in secondary causation. But we have to understand that there is a primary causation, and we should be working there too. And that primary causation is consciousness. It is consciousness. Now we look at matter, and matter evolves, and somehow consciousness seems to inhabit matter as we move up into the higher order of intelligence. But we have to ask ourselves why. What is that? As I said when we were reading the book, the scientists call it the hard problem of consciousness. There's no need for it. There's no explanation for it. It is there. And the way that we would look at this and kind of bring the two sides, the two opposing worldviews together to the one that is just right, is that matter evolved into life because life was always there in the first place. That matter is part of life itself. And spirit is part of life itself. As steam and as ice are part of water. They're all one. There's no need to be in a struggle. There's no need to fight against them. There's no need to say this one is real and that one's an illusion. We have to say that they are two parts of the whole. So when we come over into the realm of spirit, the one thing that we really want to keep in mind is that when we are weighing and measuring and touching things in the physical world, we are accepting our experience of those things as real. Okay? You and I don't weigh something. We put it on a scale, and we read the dial of the scale, and then we say, oh, well, my experience is that it said 1 pound and 7 ounces, therefore it's 1 pound and 7 ounces. But we have to recognize then that is an experience that we're having. Everything that we experience in our consciousness. And now when we move over into the realm of what we would call the spiritual, or the things that can't be weighed and measured and touched physically, now we have to ask ourselves, is our experience of those things just as valid as the experience we would have over on the physical side? So on the physical side of the argument, we would say, well, because I experienced the scale dial as this, it must be so. But if you tell me that you had a mystical experience, it can't be real because you can't weigh, measure, or touch it. Now we've got to say, well, wait a second. Is it the experience of something that we judge by, that we weigh by? And I don't think we can toss out the experiences that we have of things that can't be weighed or can't be measured or can't be touched with physical instruments. They are there. And there's been a lot of work done in this area. If you would like to look at Dr. Dean Radin, who's with the Noetic Sciences Institute, we watched a video of a lecture he gave, and he talks about things that are supposed to be just purely mechanical systems, like random number generators, and how by getting people who were practiced meditators, because they had the ability to concentrate, he used practiced meditators, that they were able somehow to have their consciousness alter the outcome of a purely mechanical system. Now, if you go into what we were reading in quantum physics, the quantum physics talks a lot about the problem of the observer, because it seems that in the presence of the observer looking for something in particular, a quantum wave of possibilities collapses into the specific thing that the observer was looking for, looking to measure. So all that all that both sides are saying is that there is this something else. There is our intention, there is our consciousness, there is the observer within us, there is this thing that is non-physical. There is this something that experiences things such as mystical experiences, such as experiencing the presence of God. So what we want to do, what we want to come to is, if we're struggling against the physical aspect of life, is to stop, because it is not meant to be a struggle. The bodies that we have are the perfect, beautiful instruments for interfacing with this life here, for weighing, for measuring, for touching, for loving, for hugging, for all of the joyful things that we do in life. And it's not to be argued against, nor is it to be accepted as that's all there is. That's all there is. Let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. No. See, the Eastern teachings talk about the razor's edge, and this is where the two opposites come together. It's such a fine point that it's easy for us to fall off. We're walking the razor's edge, and the razor's edge tells us that we have an intellect and we have consciousness. But there is a place where the intellect and the consciousness no longer work, no longer exist. There is that which is before words, but from which words come. In the materialist side of the equation, we would say, well, for example, there was this thing called the Big Bang, and everything that we know came from the Big Bang. And you would say, okay, well, that's cool. What was there before the Big Bang? And the materialist would say, we can't know that because there's no way to measure. There was no time, there was no space, there was no matter, there was nothing as we understand it today existed. So since we can only understand that which we can weigh and measure and touch by the rules that we've set up, there would be no way for us to know what happened. The razor's edge, right? So our intellect, our awareness has taken us to a point where we say, but yet there's a beyond. See, yet there's a beyond. Whether you start from the point of view that says, I purely believe in material things, or you start in the point of view that says, I purely believe in only the spiritual things. We have to say, but yet there's a beyond. Who is the observer? Who is the witness? If you go through your old shoebox and look at the pictures of when you were a child, a few years old, you don't have that body anymore. It's gone. It's the dust. It's the dust on the windowsill. It's gone. Yet you are. See, you are. Because you were the consciousness, you were the observer, you were the witness, you were not the body, you were not the material thing. There's something else that's going on. In the realm of the spiritual, we know that we know that we are here. And just like we could say of the matter, that matter has formed into life because the life was always there, we have formed into, spiritually have formed into consciousness because the consciousness was always here. We are part of something. See, the two opposites come together, and we come from that which is above, which is beyond. And whatever our concept of it might be, that's not it. Neti, not this, not that. So our growth then, in our growth, what we want to do is we want to stop a struggle. We're not trying to control matter. We're not trying to subdue matter. We're not trying to deny the experience. That's not cause. Even our consciousness is not first cause because our consciousness came from someplace else. But what we have come to realize is that by deliberately choosing our thoughts, we can have a different experience in life. And that's what we want to work with. We are that which is linked to the ultimate causation. It is that which is calling us home to itself. In a million years, all of the material things that we know will be gone. Our physical bodies will be gone, our homes will be gone, our countries will be gone, our continents may be gone, maybe more than a million years, our continents will be gone. At some point, the sun will go nova, and the earth itself will be swallowed up. And at another point, the sun itself will be swallowed up by a dark hole. Everything that we know that is material is in a state of change, in a state of flux. And yet that is not who and what we are. We are the spirit. We are the consciousness. We are the observer. So Wendy started us off this morning with a quote that said, do what you can do. Do what you can do, and do it to the best of your ability. And you'll be light years or further ahead than most other people. What we can do is we can explore our spiritual nature. We can give up any sense of struggle or control that this is true and that is false and vice versa, and say both are true. Spiritual being having a human experience. But the physical nature of our body does not define us. There is something more. There is something more. It is this thing that we call consciousness. It is the experience that leads us in the right direction. And we open ourselves up to experience the love and the presence of God through our spiritual practice, through our intention. See? Just as the physicists would say, well, they had an intention to measure something and the quantum wave collapsed so that they could measure it. What is your intention? What do you wish to experience today? I think it's every day we wish to experience a little bit more of the presence and the activity of God. We don't want to struggle against anything. We don't want to struggle with anything. We want to recognize that as we allow our consciousness to be more fully aligned with the truth that already is, then all of these effects out in the world will change by themselves. This is seek ye first the kingdom and everything else will be added unto you. Right? It's that simple. The kingdom is the presence and the activity of God. Seek that from which we came. Seek that which is the creator of both spirit and matter. Seek that which is expressing itself in everything that we see about us. Seek that. Let that be our goal, our quest, our life. And so it is.